Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am very pleased to welcome you to the fifth of the Committee on the Present Danger China's threat briefings, as we are now calling them. I'm particularly pleased to have with us via live streaming and the miracle of videotape many others who couldn't be with us today, but I'm extremely pleased that we have so many members of the committee and others who are with us to talk about the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, and for that matter, what preceded it and what has come after it, including most especially what has emerged in recent years as the present danger from China. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the president of the Center for Security, the executive chairman of the Center for Security Policy, the president of Save the Persecuted Christians, and in my capacity today as sort of the master of ceremonies, vice chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China. Others of you who have heard this before, I would ask you just bear with me, but just a very quick introduction of the concept of the Committee on the Present Danger. This was an organization that came together in several different incarnations over the past 50 years or so. We're very pleased to have with us Chet Nagel, who was at a time the executive director of one of the earlier incarnations. The most signally consequential of them, I believe, was the one that formed up in the 1970s that helped one of its members, a gentleman by the name of Ronald Reagan, conceive of and begin to articulate and then to begin to execute a strategy for defeating that era's most dangerous totalitarian communist regime, which sought the destruction of this country, namely the Soviet Union. We find ourselves today facing what is, I would argue, an even more grave existential threat to freedom, our own and that of others around the world, in the form of the Chinese Communist Party and the country that it has been misruling for decades now. We're going to talk about that danger from a number of vantage points. We're very pleased to have men who actually were in Tiananmen Square at the time of the events that we're commemorating this week. The 30th anniversary literally fell somewhere between today and tomorrow. It will be marked by our friends at the Victim of Communism Memorial tomorrow. We're noting its anniversary today. And in the course of the program, I think we'll get a lot of very important insights into how this threat has emerged, what we have ourselves done to intensify it, and what we must do to contend with it in the future. To kick us off, I'm very pleased to introduce the chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China, Brian Kennedy. He formerly was the president of the Claremont Institute, and today is the founder and president of American Strategy Group, a man with a great understanding of the sweep of history and the challenges that freedom has faced through many of those years, and I'm very proud to call him, as well as our leader, a dear friend, Brian Kennedy.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you for all you do here in Washington to make Americans safe and to understand their freedom. And thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. This Tuesday, as Frank said, marks the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square, where the People's Liberation Army killed thousands of students who were protesting how the Chinese Communist Party was running the country. That it was a human rights atrocity is obvious. It was one more deadly incarnation of Mao Zedong's belief that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. As atrocities go, however, it paled in comparison to the mass murder committed by the Chinese Communist Party and their Red Guards during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, where it is believed that 40 to 70 million people died to remake China into the country we see today. Given that this was carried out by Chairman Mao, the ideological inspiration for President Xi, examination of these events are surprisingly hard to come by. They shouldn't be. The difference, of course, was that Tiananmen was in 1989, and America had embraced the People's Republic and had fully endowed this new relationship with the belief that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization and democracy was soon to follow. An arrogance that we seem not yet to have overcome. However hopeful observers may have been, the events in Tiananmen Square demonstrated that the viciousness of the Chinese Communist Party was not about to subside. Talk of democracy and reform was not going to be tolerated, including from university students who included, it should be noted, the children of China's ruling elite. No one would be above the party, including those privileged families who would make up China's future. It was a lesson meant to be learned by both the ruling elite and the common people. The Chinese Communist Party was to be put before anything else. What should be addressed this June 4th is not so much the lives that were lost that day. The memory of their sacrifice lives on among freedom-loving people everywhere, but rather the collective naivete of America and the West, who believed that Tiananmen was an unfortunate detour in what was surely to be the road to political and economic modernization. Although American leaders would voice symbolic protestations at the time, their understanding of the nature of the Chinese Communist Party was almost non-existent. Not merely would the United States look the other way during China's ongoing trampling of human rights, but would transfer to them during the Clinton administration our most advanced nuclear missile technology, grant them most favored nation status, and share with them technological advances that would propel China into the 21st century as a superpower competitor to the United States. It was during this period that we have witnessed the perfection of Chinese communist system into the most sophisticated political organization the world has ever seen. They can control 1.4 billion people through state control of the media and the internet, engage in commerce throughout Asia, North and South America, Europe, and Africa, and develop intricate political and business relationships wherever necessary among those individual nations' ruling elites. The PRC easily blends what appears externally like a free market system with ruthless mercantilism. They deploy their state intelligence services as an arm of the nation's state-owned enterprises and engage in the theft of hundreds of billions of dollars in intellectual property and forced technology transfers from America and Western companies. One cannot be surprised that this is how the Chinese Communist Party behaves. After all, it is their purpose, in their mind, to destroy Western capitalism. What is disturbing is the corruption of American business and political elites who continue to defend the PRC, in reality the Chinese Communist Party, and serve as a powerful lobby against President Trump's common sense defense of American interests. If there's a way to honor those who died in Tiananmen Square and those people in China who today yearn for freedom, it is the vigilance of President Trump in helping this committee educate 300 million Americans about the true state of affairs in China. Our dedication to the rule of law, constitutional government, and the principles of human freedom remain the last best hope of Earth. It is the purpose of this committee to do our part to help them any way we can. We have a great lineup of speakers with us here today, and I thank you very much for being part of what we do, and I thank Frank Gaffney again for his leadership of this committee.
Brian, thank you very much. We're going to kick things off in terms of our tribute to those who lost their lives in Tiananmen Square, as well as those who have suffered horrifically at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party before and since, with one of the men who has had the extraordinary courage to stand against them inside China for quite some time. He's been described as a self-taught lawyer, a barefoot lawyer at that, working for the people of China in rural communities, advocating on behalf of their human rights, their rights particularly as women, and to the land, and in so many other ways, acting afoul of the government of China, which arrested him, incarcerating him as a political prisoner, from which he managed, in one of the great feats of all time, to escape, overcoming the handicap that is obvious and making his way to the American embassy, from which he was ultimately allowed to leave and come to this country, where he now leads, I think, both by example and through his writings and his speeches, the cause of freedom for the people of China from outside, and we are profoundly grateful to him for being with us. He is, of course, Chen Guangcheng, and I understand he will be accompanied by a translator who will help him share with us some of his insights into what has been the fate of China as a result of Tiananmen's lingering toll. Will you all come on up here to the microphone? Is that possible? Welcome.
Thank you. OK， 好，各位女士、各位先生，大家好，非常高兴呢，今天下午能在这儿跟大家交流，非常谢谢这个 Frank 先生的热情介绍。
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here this afternoon with all of you, and I would like to thank Frank for his kind introduction.
那么今天呢，站在这里，说实话，心情有点沉重。30年了，1989年中国那场发自于北京、扩大到全国的民主运动，并没有像东欧的其他国家一样解除共产专制的魔咒，让中国实现民主、宪政、法治、自由，而是在6月3号晚上、4号的凌晨，遭到中共用机枪、坦克、装甲车等直接的血腥镇压。
Today, standing here, I have a very heavy heart. It's been 30 years. In 1989, what happened in Beijing and swept to the rest of China, the whole China, didn't come to what happened to Eastern Europe later. It didn't allow China to embark on the road of freedom and democracy.
那么实际上，在那次屠杀当中，根据美国相关解密信息，至少有10454人在北京被中共屠杀，28796人伤残。那么当然这个数字不是一个确切的数字，很多人可能远远的都没有被统计进去。至少呢，这个说明中共一直宣称的天安门广场没有死人，纯粹是一种谎言。
OK， 第一个数字是多少？1万多
？10454。
According to the newly released information from the United States, that massacre actually led to the deaths of 10,454 people. And also it caused 28,796 injuries. So that lay bare the very lie of the CCP that nobody died on the Tiananmen Square.
我想，我们也从其他国家的，比如说英国这个档案馆解密的信息，还有像加拿大其他国家的解密的信息来看，这个数字都是非常接近的。当然，这是一个不完全的统计啊，实际的数字可能要远远大于这些。
And we have other sources of information, such as those from the British archives and from Canada, that these are inaccurate or incomplete statistics. More people have died or injured during the massacre.
那么，在大家把注意力都集中在北京的天安门大屠杀，或者说是北京的这个屠杀的这个事情上，我觉得实际上当时中共所想要面对的，绝不仅仅是北京。我在监狱的时候听到一个青岛的学生领袖亲口告诉我，中共在89屠杀之前，在全国各第2线、第3线城市都做了荷枪实弹的这个军队的准备。青岛的军队是从新疆紧急空运过去的。
Actually, the Chinese Communist regime wasn't just paying attention to what was happening in Beijing. They were prepared to deal with the rest of the country, the second tier and even third tier cities in China. While I was in prison, I heard a student leader from Qingdao who told me that all the cities, all the secondary and third kind of third tier cities in China were prepared with army soldiers who have real bullets. And those soldiers in Qingdao were dispatched from Xinjiang.
所以我们说，中共当时要在中国进行的这场屠杀，是中国共产党向全中国人民啊，这个来自俄罗斯的邪恶政权，向全国人民的一个宣战，毫不为过。
It is no exaggeration to say that the massacre carried out by the CCP was targeted at the whole Chinese nation.
所以从那以后，尽管中共嘴上说的很好听，实际上中共是把中国人民当成战俘来对待，是用比军费还高的维稳经费来把中国人民当成头号敌人来加以防范的。
Ever since then, the CCP regime has treated the whole Chinese people as prisoners of war. That's why they're spending more money on maintaining what they call social stability than their military expenditure.
所以89民运之后啊，特别是在6次屠杀以后，中共在中国大力的建立和扩大了像武警系统、像国保系统来对人民进行控制。
That's why, after the democracy movement, the Chinese Communist Party has established and expanded their armed police system and their national security system.
那么89之后20年里，共产党不断的在全国进行这种各种形式的，像黑头套、黑帮绑架、黑监狱、解访、非法拘禁、非法关押等等这一系列的对中国人民的任何一种争取权利的打压。
你先说20年。
对，先说后不是20年，后边10年有点变化。我要 OK。
In the 20 years after the 1989 massacre, the Chinese Communist regime has been carrying out all sorts of black practices, including gangsters, black prison, and other forms to suppress the Chinese people.
那么，随着中共的打压，那中国人民的觉醒也越来越强，那么这种反抗也就越来越多。那么，中共已经没有办法靠原来的形式继续这样进行下去。那么最近10年，中共干脆就撕掉法律的遮羞布，直接把法律修改，为了他抢夺民财的方便，为了他维护专权的方便，为了他打击中国人民的方便，那就把以前原来的很多这种像绑架、失踪合法化，写进法律第73条。
As the Chinese people awakened, the communist regime intensified its suppression. That includes not only illegal kidnapping, disappearance, and including revision of their relative laws.
所以我们看到呢，中共在这个法律当中就说，如果共产党认为是有必要，他就可以把这些人抓走，关到黑监狱里，美其名曰指定监视居住，半年之内可以不通知律师和家属，而且根据共产党自己的需要，他可以无限期的半年的去延长。那这段时间恰恰就是他们对这些人实施残酷酷刑迫害的一段时间。
That's why they say in their law that if deemed necessary, you can be thrown into prison anytime and can be held there for up to 6 months. And all sorts of things, bad things, could happen to you during those 6 months.
就在这个时候，他们就不通知律师和家属。
And they even do not notify your lawyers and your family members.
而且还可以半年的不断延长。
And they can extend it 6 months after 6 months.
所以中共在这个时候已经彻底的撕下了法律的外衣。
That's how the Chinese Communist Party has totally stripped of themselves the so-called legal protection, their clothes of law.
所以中国人民说，一声枪响，由偷变抢。那89年的枪声一响以后，共产党原来从贪污变成了直接的抢劫。所以这30年来，中共对于中国人民进行强拆对于中国农民的耕地进行强占，对于敢于上访的人直接进行殴打，甚至直接被打死在发生在中国直接被中共残害的人数，我们现在完全没有办法统计。
That's why the Chinese people say, one crack of the gunshot, the officials have transformed themselves from stealers to robbers. What they do is no less than highway robbery. They demolish people's houses by force, and they occupy farmlands by force, and they even just beat up people as they wish.
像山东的李书莲，就是因为去上访而被共产党派的这特务直接打死，还有这个像青岛的这个农民，为了看着自己的土地不被中共抢走，那么中共晚上竟然派人这个到他这个土地里的房屋上给他浇上油，点火把他活活烧死，这就是中共干的邪恶。
Let me give you 2 examples. One is Mr. Li Shulian from Shandong. The other one is a farmer from Qingdao. What the Chinese Communist Party did to him was to pour oil on his house, in his farmland, and just burn it down.
对，然后他的女儿李书莲的女儿为母亲申冤10年，到现在没有一个结果。
And the daughter of Mr. Li Shulian has been appealing for 10 years without any result.
所以，像6·4这样的事情，虽然没有大规模的在中国再次发生，但是以另一种别样的形式，在全国此起彼伏的不断存在。中共对中国人民的屠杀一天也没有停下来，只是零星的发生，不被全世界注意。 中国人民争取权利的反抗也从来没有停下来。
Although the June 4th massacre did not happen again, an event of such large scale didn't happen again, other forms of suppression has been happening one after another throughout China, and it did not cause enough attention from the international community.
所以最后我想说，我们对于6·4，我们不要什么中共平反，我们需要反思，用什么样的方法让中共为他当年的屠杀承担责任，如何去追究中共这个邪恶刽子手政权的责任，让全世界站在中国人民一边，去推动中国人民反抗中共暴政，让中国早日实现民主，把中共送入历史，这是我们应该考虑的。
So right now, what I'm calling for is not a vindication from the Chinese Communist Party, but we would rather make the Chinese Communist Party to shoulder the responsibilities for that massacre, and I call on the world to support the Chinese people in their fight for freedom and democracy.
好的，谢谢大家。
Thank you all.
Thank you。谢谢。咱们还有回答问题。OK。Thank you so much. OK。Thank you. No problem. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chen Guangcheng. It's heartbreaking to have to goad him off the stage, I have to tell you. We've just got so much that I promised to accomplish today that we're going to have to move forward. So thank you again for your leadership and courage. I think a perfect complement to what we've just heard is a man who will reflect as well as exemplify those who are fighting against communism worldwide. His name is Marion Smith. These days he is the executive director of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, an extraordinarily important organization which will be holding a vigil on the Capitol grounds tomorrow. And I commend to you that program as well. I couldn't be more pleased that he's been able to be with us, having just blown in from Budapest, I think, over the weekend, where he was commemorating the experiences of people there under Soviet communism. I did just want to say, as I introduce him, not only how much I appreciate the work he's doing, but also the leadership of the chairman of the foundation, Lee Edwards. Dr. Lee Edwards is a man who has done incalculably important work over many decades to try to make sure that no one forgets. Indeed, that everyone understands both the past as well as the abiding danger posed to us by the totalitarian ideology of communism under whatever brand it operates. And to speak about that as it relates specifically to the Chinese experience, past, present, and future, I'm very pleased to welcome Marion Smith.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be with you. I see a lot of friends and freedom fighters in this room, and I admire your work. And I know that many of you have been doing your work long before China was named a top threat, top competitor, and revisionist power in the national security strategy. So your work takes on an important new dimension now. I want to thank you, Brian Kennedy and Frank Gaffney, for your leadership of the Committee on the Present Danger. Thank you, Chen Guangcheng, for your reflections and your tireless work on behalf of the Chinese people. I'm proud to note that Chen is one of our Truman Reagan Medal of Freedom laureates, and so is most recently Cardinal Zen, Joseph Zen, former Bishop of Hong Kong. And these two individuals will be joined tomorrow by a Chinese memory organization that I'll tell you more about in a few minutes. In China today, the truth is illegal. Chinese citizens are not permitted to talk about what happened in and around Tiananmen Square 30 years ago, when the Chinese Communist Party deployed the People's Liberation Army against the Chinese unarmed protesters, many of them students. Out of that drama, we get the image of Tank Man, with which I'm sure you're all familiar. And while it is an iconic image portraying the events of June 4th in a certain sense, it is also perhaps a useful image for the Communist Party's own narrative. The reason I say that is, in that image, the street is tidy. The tanks will inevitably overcome Tank Man. His resistance is seemingly futile. And most importantly, it distracts from the blood, the shock, the chaos, the heart-wrenching turn of events that doomed the people of China to tyranny for 30 more years and counting. We don't know the exact death toll, but as Chen was talking about, we do know from a few diplomatic cables and other information that came out at the time, one in particular by the British ambassador in Beijing, that the toll was a minimum of 10,000. It is scandalous today that most Chinese do not know the full story of the massacre and are not allowed to talk about it. Mention of these events are absent from Chinese textbooks. State-controlled media are silent. Awkward telecasts every June 4th read the day's headlines without a mention of the anniversary. On the mainland, you don't speak about what happened in 1989, and online the topic is censored. Those who raise the specter of Tiananmen are harassed and jailed. Here in America, dozens of universities are complicit in this erasure of history because they work with so-called Confucius Institutes to maintain propaganda, ministry-approved study of China. And just in the last few days, Twitter, of their own volition, apparently, suspended the accounts of Chinese dissidents critical of the Chinese Communist Party and vocal about the anniversary of Tiananmen Square massacre. As a result of Communist Party censorship and Western collusion, many Chinese remain in the dark about why it happened, who was killed, and what happened to their families. We have done too little to fill in the blanks. Beijing's crackdown is rarely discussed within diplomatic and business circles, lest it rankle Sino-US relations or disrupt Wall Street. For years, in fact, the West has overlooked or sidestepped China's capacity for violent repression in favor of dovish overtures. Such a strategy has proven dangerously naive against the Chinese Communist Party. Those of us in the West who benefit from freedom of speech have a responsibility to defend truthful memory against those who would make us forget. Revealing the truth means coming to terms with how millions of Chinese citizens felt about their government. In addition to Beijing's murderous response carried out on the orders of Deng Xiaoping, the communist leader known in the West for his liberalization of the Chinese economy. What happened in the spring of 1989 was far bloodier than any image or news report seen by us in the West. The Communist Party viewed the Tiananmen protests, one of many across the country in the spring of '89, as an existential threat. Party hardliners feared a potential government coup, and as a result, they won the debate in the inter-party discussion about what to do. From that moment began a reign of oppression and manipulation of the Chinese people through ultra-nationalism and propaganda, a reign that has not ended. Those party hardliners feared the unarmed student protesters. They feared a modest statue that they erected in Tiananmen Square. The student protesters called it the goddess of democracy, and it was patterned after our own Statue of Liberty. And here, please allow me to take a few words in tribute to the great man that Frank spoke about, Lee Edwards. He's chairman of our foundation, and it took over a decade of work by Lee and many others. But in 2007, President George W. Bush dedicated the first memorial in the world in honor of every single victim of communism since 1917. If you haven't seen it, the Victims of Communism Memorial is at the corner of New Jersey and Massachusetts Avenues, a few blocks away. And by selecting the Sino-specific symbol for the memorial, which is a bronze replica of the Goddess of Democracy statue, that decision was controversial at the time, but Lee understood something important. The Berlin Wall had fallen, but communism hadn't, and the most powerful remaining communist dictatorship was, of course, the People's Republic of China. The choice of that symbol has proven prescient now that Americans are wising up to the fact that the greatest threat to freedom and peace in the world today is the Chinese Communist Party. One of the principal ways in which unjust regimes govern without the consent of their people is by distorting history and hiding truth. To be sure, the China of today is not Mao's China. The Communist Party since the 1990s has incorporated limited market-based reforms, but China remains a single-party communist dictatorship that stifles free speech and dissent, and under Xi Jinping remains officially committed to socialism with Chinese characteristics. China's government stubbornly refuses to come to terms with the victims it has unjustly imprisoned, sent to labor camps, and killed, a number in the tens of millions, far eclipsing the murderous Nazi and Soviet regimes. Human rights activists and dissidents like Chen Guangchen are harassed, persecuted, and forced to flee the country. As Czech novelist Milan Kundera has noted, the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. That struggle requires that we tell the truth and advocate for human rights, even when inconvenient. Ultimately, however, I believe this is the most strategically sound path. Soviet dissident Natan Sharansky has called human rights a, quote, powerful non-conventional weapon against which the other side has no defense. Even though the CCP is successfully revising history for a generation of young Chinese, China's government is failing in its efforts to erase the past because, in the words of Hannah Arendt, the holes of oblivion do not exist. Nothing human is that perfect, and there are simply too many people in the world to make oblivion possible. Indeed, courageous men and women still speak out, including those whose loved ones were killed in the massacre 30 years ago. The memory organization comprised of Chinese individuals I mentioned earlier are the Tiananmen Mothers. The Tiananmen Mothers deserve our attention and our support. The boys and girls killed in the early morning hours of June 4th, 30 years ago, were their sons and daughters. And they, more than anyone else, refused to let the world forget what happened. China's rulers have tried to muzzle the Tiananmen Mothers in every way. Although they are elderly, authorities routinely throw them into prison, place them under house arrest, monitor their every movement, block their communication, and disrupt their daily lives. And yet, still the mothers refuse to back down. As a group, these mothers wrote in a letter earlier this year that the indomitable courage of their children, the ones they lost, has always been with them. And this is why the Tiananmen Mothers will never be silent. The Tiananmen Mothers continue the fight for freedom that their sons and daughters started. They have inspired a new generation of leaders and freedom fighters in China and across the world to renew the struggle against the tyranny of the Chinese Communist Party. They remind us that 30 years ago, the will of the Chinese people was thwarted by the will of the Communist Party, the guilty party, the party that still governs. For their courage and perseverance, the Tiananmen Mothers have our recognition and our solidarity. And tomorrow at 1:30, we'll be co-hosting a major rally with more than 20 other organizations on the Capitol grounds, and we'll be bestowing our Truman Reagan Medal of Freedom on the Tiananmen Mothers, and I hope all of you will join us. We'll also be opening an exhibit photographic exhibit about their sons and daughters, also on the Capitol grounds. And this evening, as Frank mentioned, at 8 o'clock, we're hosting a candlelight vigil at the Victims of Communism Memorial, and you all are also invited to join us there. thank you for your attention, for the invitation. Thank you for your important work. And the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is your ally in all of this work. And we also are making sure that a new generation of young Americans at the high school, middle school, and college levels understands the history of the 20th century and the still ongoing human rights violations, abuses, tyranny of communist parties today. So, thank you, Frank.
We're going to try to make this a little bit interactive at the risk of getting off schedule, but we could take one quick question, if there is one, for Marion Smith. Yes, sir. Robert Lee? Do we have a microphone? Stand by just 1 second, please.
I know that you are planning to have a museum built up around National Mall. How is that plan going?
So, in case you didn't hear it, he asked about the museum effort that our foundation is involved with. In 1993, the United States Congress unanimously passed a law authorizing the establishment of our foundation, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And since that time, it's been a long-standing goal that we establish a museum for the victims of communism here in Washington, D.C. The 2007 dedication of the Victims of Communism Memorial was an important step in the direction of the memory projects that ultimately will include the museum. You may have seen we have received a few large gifts in support of the museum, and we are actively working to fundraise for the museum, and we're fairly far along in the planning process, and there'll be more public information coming out about that very soon. But since 1917, 100 years, some 40 countries that have experienced Communist Party rule, a death toll of over 100 million. In the case of the Soviet Union, in the case of Cambodia, 25% of the population killed by their government as a matter of policy in peacetime. With the language of equality, communist parties brought to the world a new form of modern slavery. And that is a history that must be known. The ideas of Marxism must be discredited. And communism and socialism, even socialism with Chinese characteristics, needs to be seen as an ideology, a system of government that belongs on the ash heap of history, and not in any sense a system that should define the 21st century. Yeah. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Well, speaking of the ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party, I'm very pleased to say we have a distinguished historian and author, Dr. Bradley Thayer, with us. He has recently become a professor at the University of Texas in San Antonio. He is the author of numerous books on the subjects of what the Chinese are up to, among other topics. And he's agreed to join us today to talk quickly about Xi Jinping and communist fundamentalism and why another Tiananmen Square is possible. Brad, welcome.
Indeed. Thank you, Frank. Thank you for that warm introduction. And I'd like to thank Brian Kennedy, of course, and Frank Gaffney, and all of those who made this gathering possible, but also those who have supported in every way this committee and its important work. I'd like to talk to you this afternoon about Xi Jinping and communist fundamentalism, why another Tiananmen Square massacre is possible. As we commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, it's important not only to remember the terrible tragedy and the viciousness and determination of the Communist Party of China to stay in power, but also to recognize 4 additional elements. First, this was a terrible lost opportunity for China. Secondly, to understand the lessons drawn by both Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping. Thirdly, to recognize that it could happen again in Xi Jinping's China. And fourth, it's a seminal event that draws a sharp distinction between the West and China under the Communist Party. And in a certain and very direct respect, it made the rule of Xi Jinping possible. In the late spring of 1989, millions of people went to the streets in Beijing to demand political reforms. It was perhaps the largest peaceful protest in China since the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949, and perhaps even the largest event in the history of modern China. What was unique about the pro-democracy movement that gathered in Tiananmen Square was that the protesters came from within and outside of the Communist Party structure. They sought to make China a modern country with democracy and the rule of law. Famously, as Marian Smith observed, they constructed the 30-foot plaster-covered goddess of democracy statue in the center of Tiananmen Square, which recalled, of course, the Statue of Liberty and Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. Of course, Deng Xiaoping refused their demands and instead ordered the People's Liberation Army to march into Beijing and retake Tiananmen Square from the student protesters. The party would not tolerate a challenge to its rule, and the PLA attack resulted in the deaths of thousands of innocent people. As we've heard this afternoon, the exact casualties are still unknown due to the Communist Party of China's deliberate cover-up and censorship of the information concerning the event. Of course, 1989 was a momentous year. In the Soviet bloc, pro-democracy movements, at first in Poland and in Hungary, triggered a chain reaction that ultimately led to the collapse of Soviet satellites and later the Soviet Union itself. In contrast, the June 4th massacre is a tragedy for modern China, which took the country in a very unfortunate direction. The real cost of the massacre was that China lost the opportunity to become what China has been, and indeed should be again, a great, enlightened, and sublime power. Deng drew seminal lessons from the collapse of communism in the USSR and its Eastern Bloc allies. Accordingly, he recognized that it was the Communist Party of China's economic performance that would provide legitimacy for the party. And this solution, of course, worked for decades. But heady economic growth is waning in China, and consequently the party's legitimacy is also vulnerable to challenge. Xi drew a very different lesson from the Soviet Union's collapse. He believes the Soviet Party leaders' communist ideals and convictions wavered, certainly after the death of the last true Bolshevik, Mikhail Suslov, in 1982. Those who ran the Politburo lost their faith in communism, and so they lost control of its ideology and ultimately their power. Xi's solution is what may only be considered communist fundamentalism, the desire to return to traditional Leninism and Maoism as political ordering principles, to enforce its ideology and require a resolute commitment to it in order to ensure that the party's control of political thought is maintained and that there will be no crises of faith among the adherents of communism in China. No questioning of the communist fundamentalist beliefs. As a communist fundamentalist, Xi understands that to preserve the party and its control requires tightly controlling the internet to police thought and expression. It dictates absolute loyalty from the military to ensure regime stability. And many measures that he's implemented, including the use of high-tech surveillance, have turned China into a super police state with little room for dissent within it. Xi Jinping's mistakes and gross human rights abuses, such as suppressing millions of Uyghurs and Kazakhs, ensures that a random event may trigger civil disobedience and in turn may evolve into another Tiananmen protest. In sum, a new spark could occur at any time, and as an acolyte of Lenin and Mao, Xi's natural proclivity is to use force and violence to maintain power at all costs. This also means that he'll use any mechanism to crush dissent. The probability of repeating the Tiananmen strategy under Xi is far higher than under his predecessors in post-Deng China. Another Tiananmen Square massacre would be a humanitarian disaster, dangerous for China and for the global community. 30 years ago, the U.S. missed a historic chance to intervene to prevent the bloody crackdown in its wake, to labor to weaken the party's chokehold over China. Mark Twain is purported to have written that history does not repeat itself, but it does in fact rhyme. This lamentable past provides a valuable lesson for the United States and its allies to prepare for history's rhyme, should it occur, and act against repression. Finally, Tiananmen is significant because it illuminates the differences between the West and China. It can be said that Stalin was responsible for both saving the Soviet Union through his totalitarianism and ensuring its collapse. His brutal policies, including forced hyper-industrialization, allowed the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazi invasion. But in the long run, the totalitarian system that he created could not change and ultimately collapsed. Likewise, in one respect, Deng saved the Communist Party of China in its rule by brutally crushing the pro-democracy movement in 1989. But ultimately, by so doing, he made Xi possible. Xi may greatly damage or destroy the party's control of China due to his communist fundamentalist beliefs and his reckless ambition. Once the U.S. understands the objectives and ruthlessness that he possesses, that he is in fact a communist fundamentalist, it can recognize the clear danger he presents to U.S. national security interests and to international stability. In the domestic realm, Xi's very clear, calling for the strengthening of the Communist Party's chokehold over the country. His faith in himself and the Communist Party of China is absolute. Internationally, his actions are equally dangerous, supporting China's aggressive expansion in South China Sea and elsewhere, threatened the use of force to seize and occupy Taiwan, backed authoritarian regimes from Russia to Venezuela to Zimbabwe, and expanded China's influence and control over less developed states through the Belt and Road Initiative. He's the global leader of opposition to the U.S. position in international politics and the present international order, which has kept peace for over a generation and provided prosperity to many millions, including within China. Xi's vision for global politics is one where China is supreme and international order is decidedly illiberal. From Xi's speeches, particularly speech to the 19th Party Congress, his intent of defeating the U.S. is transparent, as is his desire to replace the dominance in Western values in global politics with those of the values of the Chinese Communist parties. So he's a clear danger to the Chinese people due to his repression, and he's an equal danger to the present world order as a result of his determination to destroy it. To change the situation, much needs to be done. Let me just touch on very briefly two measures. First, Washington needs to reaffirm its commitment to Western values, political ideology of liberalism, and the principles that stand in positive light when compared to Chinese oppressive government. Second, the Chinese people must be supported in their effort to avoid a return to the past, ruled by another communist fundamentalist. Democratic forces, both within and outside the system, must stand up to Xi's dictatorship. And the global community should also send a strong signal to the Chinese people about its preference for a stable and peaceful leader to lead that great nation. For millennia, Chinese civilization was unrivaled in its historical stability, elegance, and sophistication. The Chinese people should be led by a person who's the equal of that greatness rather than by a despot. China has left its political dark ages behind. We can define the period in Chinese history from the first Opium War to the end of Maoism as its dark ages. It has entered a period of a renaissance, where you've seen the rebirth of Chinese power in every respect. The key question for us to consider today is whether China will enter a political enlightenment. Sadly, with Xi's leadership and the party's leadership, it's very unlikely that China will reach any form of political enlightenment as long as the party rules. Well, thank you very much for your attention this afternoon, and my thanks again to Frank and to Brian for the opportunity. Thank you, Frank.
Dr. Thayer has agreed to take a question if there is one. Anybody? Yes, sir. Marion?
Would you just give your thoughts on Xi's use of Maoism, Marxism as an ideology within the party? And do you think that he's a true believer?
Marion, thank you very much for that important question. I think that his use of Maoism as well as Leninism, obviously, if you will, the grandfather of the Chinese Communist Party, is frequent and I believe fervent in his belief. I truly believe that he has looked and studied the collapse of the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc allies assiduously. That case has been very well studied by them, and they're determined not to repeat their errors. The importance or the abandonment of ideology as legitimating structure for the Soviet Communist Party was seen to be a fundamental mistake, and they're determined not to use that again. So I truly believe that he is a communist fundamentalist, he is a Leninist, he is a Maoist, and he truly believes in the value of despotism and of crushing and not permitting any political dissent within China to sustain his power. And that's a terrible situation for China in which to be. Thank you
so
so much.
I should have mentioned that Brad Thayer is a member of the Committee on the Present Danger. We're very proud to have him as such, and pleased as well to welcome to our podium a man who is actually in the process of co-authoring with Dr. Thayer a new book on the coming war with China, I believe it's called. His name is Lianchao Han. He is the co-founder and vice president of the Independent Federation of Chinese Students and Scholars, and a very active participant in this committee's programs. We're delighted to have him back to talk a little bit about the CCP's regime resilience and civil resistance post-Tiananmen. Lianchao.
Good afternoon. On the eve of the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square massacre, I would like to thank all of you gathered here to commemorate the fallen and reflect upon the event to help China move forward. I'm sure you have heard the Chinese defense minister's remarks about Tiananmen Square massacre. He insisted it was a riot and the crackdown was correct and justified. Of course, that's bogus. But it indicates, as Brad just said, that Xi Jinping's regime has fully entrenched to use force again without hesitation to murder anyone in the way of his one-party rule. So, Tiananmen Square massacre is still highly relevant. It is worthwhile for us to take a look at the dynamics in post-Tiananmen China. After the massacre, many, including myself, were too optimistic about China's future. Despite the bloody crackdown, we believed that within a few years, the communist regime would fall. But 30 years later, the CCP has not only survived the crisis and remained in power, but has reached unprecedented levels of global influence. How does the CCP regime become so resilient? In my view, the CCP learned from the June 4th massacre and made preventing the recurrence of the 1989 pro-democracy movement its top priority to avoid regime collapse. Immediately after Tiananmen Square massacre, Deng Xiaoping directed the regime to use two-hands approach to handle the crisis. On the one hand, it greatly strengthened the security apparatus using military, the police, the judicial system, and the propaganda machine to relentlessly crack down on dissidents and purge internal rivalry. They purchased lots of anti-riots equipment, interrogation technologies from the West. Later, built a vast stability maintenance system to nip the buds of opposition, and immediately stopped all political system reform. On the other hand, Deng Xiaoping redirected China to focus on economic development and continue the implementation of economic reforms to reassert the regime's legitimacy, justify the bloody crackdown. Trade and economic development were carried out as a matter of deliberate regime survival policy. In the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre, the party encouraged the masses to forget about politics and their own freedom and dedicate themselves to making money. At the same time, the regime also became more adaptive with diversified and more sophisticated governance means, resulting in greater control of state power, then also curtailed temporarily the party president's profiteering activities to quell the public anger. Deng Xiaoping's strategy worked well. West countries dropped their economic sanctions, and massive amounts of international capital and technology flew in and stabilized the region while exploiting the low wages and poor conditions of the Chinese workers. Economic grew rapidly, which indeed raised many boats. It is true that China's growth has been one of the most important factors enabling government control over the population, despite never resolving the underlying social political issues. One of these issues is corruption. When China opened to outside world, Deng Xiaoping had instructed the region to allow riches to flow to a small sum of people first. To do that, China adopted a dual-track economic system in which the government introduced certain elements of capitalism by allowing private enterprises to have limited access to certain sectors, all the while maintaining socialist economy as its core. This dual-track system allows for the privileged class to become rich at expenses of common citizenry and has become the hotbed for systematic corruption in China. At the same time, allow the state to control the wealth created by the Chinese people. Governments at all levels carried out the fast-growing policy in a predatory manner. Officials forcefully demolished people's homes, took their assets, closed their factories, ignored environmental impact, created injustice, unfairness, general discontent in the entire nation. This resulted in a revival of rampant profiteering, almost exclusively enjoined by the presidents and the government officials. It triggered even much broader systematic corruption than that of the pre-Tiananmen Square era, turning China into a totalitarian kleptocracy. In turn, civil resistance has been on the rise, despite regime's unprecedented repression. Civil resistance took many forms. Over the span of the past 30 years, it has emerged in the form of a remembrance of the June 4th massacre to seek reverse of the regime's verdict on the 1989 pro-democracy movement. The pro-democracy activists on China's mainland also realized the importance of having political party on which a viable opposition could be built. Indeed, they have tried repeatedly to establish their own party. The Tibetan and Uyghur uprising in 2008 also appeared to take the CCP internal security system by surprise. Civil resistance continued through 2008 as activists associated with the Chapter 08 movement joined together on the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Chapter 08, originally a manifesto co-authored by Nobel Prize winner Liu Xiaobo, demanded constitutional democracy and the political reform to ensure human rights for the Chinese people. The charter received more than 10,000 signatures. In early 2011, inspired by the Arab Spring, Chinese pro-democracy activists worked hard to attempt launch intensive protests known as Jasmine Revolution in dozens of Chinese cities, resulting in widespread tension among the CCP regime. The New Citizen Movement was another major political and social campaign took place, It promoted peaceful transition towards democracy, constitutionalism, advocated for equal education rights for migrant workers' children in the larger cities, engaged in citizen activism under the banner freedom, justice, and love. Between 2012 2013, as part of the movement, new citizen groups went to the street to demand that government officials publicly disclose their assets and the income. In addition, the rights defense movement presented a special challenge to the regime because human rights lawyers armed with the Chinese laws and with the internet, they could reach out to the public for organized support and help victims of human rights abuse to get justice. In fact, internet aided in the spread of democratic idea and raised rights awareness in China. It became China's virtual public square and provided a platform for people to criticize CCP leaders, to question and challenge their one-party rules, and to expose corruption and social injustice. Internet actually allowed Chinese individuals and the community to organize through social media and collectively push for change. Using internet, the rights lawyers won many cases. Of course, all above civil resistance campaigns failed, were suppressed by the Chinese regime. The Chinese regime has become even more dictatorial and more repressive. Under Xi Jinping, the regime has entered a mood of bottom line thinking. That is, all civil resistance activities, no matter how small, must take seriously, as if the regime's survival depends on it. With this mentality, the Xi Jinping regime has weaponized mass surveillance for mind control, information control, population control to ensure its regime's security. Over the years, it has been spent enormous money to build a total surveillance system. Consists of 3 main platforms: Skynet, Safe City, and Sharp Eyes, that target both cities and rural areas. China is about to complete its installation of 2.7 cameras around the country with 50 million cameras that has a visual recognition capability. The surveillance system integrates other big data and AI technologies such as banking data, mobile payment apps, WeChat, social credit score system, third generation ID card, biometric info, Great Firewall, mobile phones, televisions, and other surveillance hardware and software. The totality of this allowed the CCP to weave a tight net that no one can escape their watch. It has effectively silenced the voice of political and civil activists in public space. But silence does not mean submission and consent. In fact, Chinese civil society not only exists, but becomes stronger. And the people's rights awareness has significantly increased. The undercurrents are surging everywhere in China. Any random event could trigger another Tiananmen protest at any moment. Finally, I would like to point out that American politicians and financial elite helped the CCP regime survive Tiananmen Square massacre. Today, American companies, Wall Street, and universities are still helping Xi Jinping build this pervasive surveillance system to suppress the Chinese people, which is a real shame. A half century ago, Professor Sutton wrote a book called Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, in which he collected sufficient evidence to show that Wall Street elite quote, do not journey to Washington as lobbyists and administrators in order to serve the United States. They are in Washington to serve their own profit-maximizing interests. Their purpose is not to further competitive free market economy, but to manipulate a politicized regime, call it what you will, to their own advantage, unquote. The Wall Street elite aided Hitler's rise, which led to the World War II disaster. And they're still helping Xi Jinping, or Chinese people call Hitler. So let's not forget the lessons of history. Thank you very much.
A question for Lian Chao? Yes, ma'am. There is a microphone. It needs to be a little more centrally located, I think.
Is it on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Lian Chao, I want to thank you for all of the great things that you've done for your people.
Thank you.
And also for your hard work here in Washington. There's something that some of us are aware of, being Washingtonians, and some are not. And I'd like to bring to everybody's attention something that happened on June 22nd, 1989. There was something known as the Tiananmen Square Park Authorization Act. It was set up by my now late husband. It was a piece of property that came about when he asked me one day at breakfast, how do we fix this? How do we get back at them? And I said, again, being a Washingtonian, that it's really interesting because there's a little square right across from the Chinese embassy. So perhaps what you might be able to do, being the chairman of the Energy Committee and so forth, you might be able to figure out a way that you can rename the square Tiananmen Square and leave it that way. And it was done. So recently, some of us went to see what had been done or not done. The sign has, of course, disappeared. The encroachment of the embassy appears to have almost incorporated the square into their property. This has been done deliberately, obviously. And also, I asked each one of you, and especially Marion, I was really interested in what you had to say today, to figure out how the hell we get that thing renamed again, Tiananmen Square. So that's what I have to say. Thank you very much, Lian Chao.
Thank you. I think that's a great idea. Senator Wallop used to be, I worked with him. He was a strong supporter for the pro-democracy movement in China. He actually hosted Tiananmen Square student leader Chai Lin to intern in his office. I think it's a great idea to revive that place because we have so many protests in front of the Chinese embassy, the Tiananmen Square, and Chinese government so afraid, so they moved the embassy. But that place is still there, and they built the Chinese embassy. I think is another branch of their residence in the old embassy. It would be a great idea. We can officially name that place as Tiananmen Square. Thank you, French.
Thank you, French Wallop. Also, Lian Chao, thank you particularly for both calling attention to this police state apparatus that is being now not only employed against the Chinese people, but also against the people of other nations as well. Also, for highlighting a topic that our colleague Roger Robinson will talk about shortly in terms of Wall Street underwriting these kinds of activities. Next up, I'm very pleased to say we have a woman who has literally devoted her life to trying to raise the awareness about one of the most horrific and comprehensive forms of human rights abuse imaginable. And that is something that we've coined a term for, the womb police. The enforcement of the one child or two child or some child limit that the Chinese Communist Party and a few others, I must say, have been using to horrific effect, now of a great and terrible demographic consequence for their own people. Her name is Reggie Littlejohn. She is a lawyer by training, but has become the president of a marvelous organization, Women's Rights Without Frontiers. Reggie, welcome.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Brian Kennedy. Thank you for the committee on the present danger for having this event, which is extremely important, extremely timely, particularly at this juncture in history. And I am honored to speak about one of the most egregious instances of the CCP's unrestricted war against freedom, the coercive enforcement of China's one-child policy. Over the past 39 years, China has waged a war against women. The CCP has functioned as womb police, declaring life or death over every pregnancy in China. They claim that they have prevented 400 million births. Now that number, 400 million, is greater than the entire population of the United States and the entire population of Canada combined. How did they prevent these births? Through forced abortion, forced sterilization, and even infanticide. The coercive enforcement of China's one-child policy is the greatest violation of women's rights and indeed the greatest violation of human rights on the earth today and in the history of the world, simply because of the massive numbers involved. It has been estimated that 65 million people died as a result of Mao Zedong's creation of a socialist China through the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and other means. This number is mind-numbing, and it makes him the greatest mass murderer of the 20th century. Yet even that number is eclipsed by the 400 million lives prevented by the one-child policy. So I would add to that 65 million, 400 million. So you get 465 million deaths due to the Chinese Communist Party. The two-child policy has not stopped this slaughter. The new rule is every couple is allowed to have 2 children. What does that mean in practice? That means you have to be married. You have to be part of a couple in order to have a child. So that leaves single women still at risk of forced abortion, and third pregnancies also have been forcibly aborted. Now, there have been a whole series of unintended consequences that have caused immeasurable suffering in China and falling like a series of dark dominoes as a result of the one-child policy. Number one, forced abortion. This has continued even since the two-child policy was instituted on January 1st of 2016. In November of 2018, NPR reported that there was a Kazakh woman who was forcibly aborted of her third child. What happened is this. She was marrying somebody in Kazakhstan. She wanted to give up her Chinese citizenship. She crossed the border into China. To give up her Chinese citizenship, they discovered she was pregnant with a third child. That's legal in Kazakhstan, but not in China. So they forcibly aborted her third child. November 2018. Forced sterilization. What do I mean by forced sterilization? As Frank mentioned, I am an attorney. I was practicing law in San Francisco. I represented a Chinese refugee in her case for political asylum. She was persecuted as a Christian and also forcibly sterilized. In her case, what it meant was that cadres came to her door daily trying to convince her to be sterilized. She refused because people in her village would have their entire health ruined by these sterilizations. So finally, they just physically picked her up, carried her out of her home screaming and crying, held her down to a table, cut her open, tied her fallopian tubes. This is all without anesthesia. And as a result, they ruined her health. She had chronic back pain, chronic migraines, chronic abdominal pain for the rest of her life, or at least until I represented her, which was many years later. Okay, so forced abortion, forced sterilization, unintended consequences, gendercide, the sex-selective abortion of baby girls. China has had the worst sex ratio of any country in the world, and it has not stopped under the two-child policy. In fact, in some ways, it's almost become worse. We don't have the next, they're going to have another census in 2020, so we don't have the current numbers, but I will tell you an incident. This was in Anhui province in July 2017, so this was under the two-child policy. A couple had a daughter. They were fine. They were satisfied. We have our kid. Along comes the two-child policy in 2017, and then the idea is, oh, wait, we have a girl, let's get a boy. The husband forced his wife to abort 4 baby girls in a year. When she became ill, he divorced her, and then she died. And I can tell you many other instances of gendercide that have happened. This is the thing. Even under the two-child policy, there's son preference. We can go into that if you want to ask a question about why. But people will let their if the first kid is a girl, they'll let her live. But then they're saying, oh, but we can have a boy on the second child. So second daughters are still very vulnerable to sex-selective abortion. That has led to a gender imbalance where there are now an estimated 37 million more men than women living in China. And that has led to human trafficking and sexual slavery. So, for example, in the June 2018 Trafficking in Persons report put out by our State Department, China was listed as a Tier 3 nation, one of the worst offenders in the world. How do you get to be a Tier 3 nation? Number one, you have to have a terrible record on human trafficking, and number two, you need to not be doing anything about it or not enough about it, okay? Why does China not take more action against human trafficking? Could it be the 37 million quote-unquote excess males that they have? What are they going to do with all these frustrated men if they don't have trafficked women? It's really a sick calculation that they're making. And by the way, I know that something that is important to Frank and me, and I think everybody here, what are they going to do with the 37 million excess males? Does this pose some kind of international security risk? Wouldn't it be convenient to put them in the military? Okay, so China made an adjustment from a one-child policy to a two-child policy. The entire infrastructure of coercion is still in place to enforce the two-child policy, and they did it not because they were repenting of their human rights violations. No, they did it because they're facing a demographic disaster. Their workforce has decreased. They're facing a senior tsunami, and they're in such a difficult situation right now with respect to seniors that over the last 20 years, senior suicide has skyrocketed 500%. Why is that? Because the one-child policy has destroyed the family structure of China. They used to have large families. It was not a problem to help the seniors as they got old. Now they have small families. There's no one left to take care of grandma and grandpa, especially grandma. When grandpa dies, China has the highest female suicide rate in the world. Also, 590 women a day kill themselves in China. In the Chinese countryside, 3 times the number of women as men kill themselves. And seniors, and especially senior widows, are killing themselves. All right. He says I have to finish up. So why does China continue with any kind of coercive enforcement of population control when they need more babies? Okay. I believe it's social control masquerading as population control. The one-child policy touches everyone in China, and it is an instrument of terror. The wound police function as domestic terrorists. So what can we do about it? Number one, Women's Rights Without Frontiers is the only organization in the world that has boots on the ground inside of China, actively saving baby girls and abandoned widows. Number two, we can keep up the pressure, the international pressure. The CCP said that international criticism was one of the reasons they are thinking about abandoning coercive birth control. And then number three, we can use the Global Magnitsky Act, which authorizes the U.S. government to sanction human rights offenders, freeze their assets, and ban them from entering the United States. And I think that this is a great way to send a message to China that we're not going to take this anymore. Thank you.
Would there be a question for Reggie Littlejohn? Marion?
Thank you, Reggie. Could you speak just briefly about how the party or how the government presents this policy? Obviously, there's a lot about the techniques, the consequences of the policy that they don't admit, they don't acknowledge. But in terms of public statements or the general public, how do they defend this policy? How do they present it as a social good?
Well, I mean, typically what they will do, and they've changed their rhetoric over the last couple of years because they've had to, but what they have said is, look at us. We have 1.4 billion people. We have just too big of a population. We need to be able to control it. Well, yes, they have the biggest population in the world, and yes, their population is growing. You want to know why it's growing? Because the seniors are living longer. It's the elderly that are growing. And they don't address the fact that they need more of a young population to support the elderly population, and they need more girls. Now they have realized that actually that this is the case, and they're desperate for babies. And this is just another form of coercion, trying to force people. Every couple that is allowed to have 2 children must have 2 children. I mean, they're pressuring people to have babies when they don't want them. But the last thing I want to say is this: I believe that China is going to announce either that they're moving to a 3-child policy or that that they will allow all couples to have as many children as they want. Watch the language. Because if they say all couples are allowed to have as many children as they want, that still leaves single women open to forced abortion, and it still leaves the entire infrastructure in place. They need to be saying everyone can have as many kids as they want, not just all couples. Thank you.
I can't impress upon you enough how horrible this apparatus that Reggie talked about is. When you think about literally women having to be inspected, their wombs inspected with regularity to ensure that they aren't pregnant, or they are but not impermissibly. It's staggering, and it is about control. I think Reggie's absolutely right. Thank you for that.